I'm Bob McCoskrie. My special guest today is Dr Kirk Durston. He's a Canadian scientist, aircraft engineer, clergyman, philosopher, father, husband, nature photographer, and wilderness adventurer. And he left engineering to work with Power to Change at universities across Canada for the past 37 years, thinking, writing and speaking about the interaction of science, theology and philosophy within the context of authentic Christianity. And he's a leading thinker on the work of JD Unwin's classic book, Sex and Culture. And Kirk, it's a great privilege to have you here in New Zealand online. One day we'll get you here in person. You're on the east of Canada, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm in the eastern half. If people know where Toronto is, I'd be about an hour northwest of Toronto.
Okay. Look, let's get straight into it because we've got limited time. Give us an overview. A lot of people won't have heard of JD Unwin's work. They won't have heard of the book Sex and Culture, but they'll be watching the culture and seeing this interaction, this interplay. So give us an overview of his work.
Sure. And if you want me to expound on any particular point, don't hesitate to stop me and ask me to go a little deeper. But JD Unwin was a cultural anthropologist. He taught at both Oxford and Cambridge in the 1930s. And immediately you might be wondering, 1930s, why would we be interested in the research of some fellow who lived and who did it in the 1930s? But he was particular, and I'll get to that in a moment, but he was especially interested on the relationship between sexual restraint practiced by a culture and how well that culture flourished in terms of architecture, literature, agriculture, music, and so forth. And he studied 86 civilizations and societies and cultures, including, quite a range of cultures, more than 24 North American cultures, cultures across the South Pacific, East Asia, and the Middle East, and even as far back as the Sumerians and the Babylonians, the ancient Greeks and the Romans. But the question is, what relevance does his research have today? Well, first of all, he found something that was rather shocking. He found that there's a tipping point. When a culture loosens up its sexual restraints, there's a tipping point. And once it crosses that tipping point, it collapses within 3 generations, which Unwin defined as approximately 100 years. And there were no exceptions. It was irreversible. It's a serious problem. 86 cultures was what he looked at, and he covered it in incredible detail. His book contains a lot of the data, and if you're ever having a problem falling asleep at night, that'll be like a general anesthetic. It'll knock you right out cold after about 10 minutes of slogging through his data. But the question is, though, how do we know that we can trust his findings today?
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask, because, I mean, a lot of people haven't heard of JD Unwin. And so, has he been discounted because people just think, oh, he's just a prude, or he hasn't been able to back up what he's saying? I mean, why haven't we heard more about him?
Yeah, well, a couple of good questions you just raised there. Was he a prude, first of all? Probably not. When I read his book, and I've gone through it twice, just it's tedious going, and he shows no signs whatsoever of being a religious person. His discussions of the religions, including Christianity, is very clinical, maybe almost cold. There doesn't seem to be any bias towards that or morality of any particular religious group. But one of the things that really seemed to underscore his relevance today, I published basically a summary of his work. And within a day, there's a professor, internationally distinguished Professor Robert P. George at Princeton University.
Robert George, great guy.
Yeah, and somebody brought my article to his attention, and he actually endorsed it and pointed out that Unwin is unmatched. Basically, nobody has done the detail level of research that Unwin did to this day. His work is unexceeded. And the other thing about Unwin is that he was strictly doing observation. That's pretty much what he did have some He did speculate a little bit near the end of his book as to why the culture would collapse once the tipping point was crossed. And I haven't specified the tipping point yet. But once that tipping point was crossed, there was a complete collapse. But there were three things that happened between the tipping point being crossed and the collapse of that culture. And those three things allow us today in the 21st century to actually test his findings. They're like predictions. So if those three things come true in our civilization, then we know we're pretty much signed up for a collapse, perhaps somewhere around 2080 or before. Okay. Basically 100 years since we crossed that tipping point in our Western culture.
Okay.
So there's two reasons. One, his work is unsurpassed to this day. Number two, we can test his work with these three predictions, as it were, and they're all coming true quite remarkably.
And so to reiterate, he didn't write this after the sexual revolution in the 60s, 70s. He wrote this in 1930?
1934, and that's the beauty of it. At first people say 1934, but then the beauty of 1934, writing so long ago, is he was long before our own sexual revolution. And some people debate, there's some debate as to when that began. I tend to think it began around the mid-1960s. Some would argue, well, no, it actually began with a change in attitude towards morality that happened during World War II amongst the soldiers in Europe and so forth. Regardless, the tipping point is a little easier to nail down. And here's the shocking part. I was shocked, at least when I found out what that tipping point was. I had pictured in my mind that you have a sexual revolution, sexual freedom happens, and then they practice more and more bizarre things. And eventually it gets so bizarre that the tipping point is crossed. No, what Unwin found is that, and brace yourself, the tipping point is prenuptial sex. When that becomes, now prenuptial sex has been going on since who knows when, but it's when it becomes normalized, when it becomes accepted in the society, that's the tipping point, prenuptial sex. And I was shocked that it was that level of basically sexual restraint is very important, and sexual restraint to the point of best to wait until marriage. And he talked about lifelong monogamy. Basically, that's one partner for life, one spouse you marry, and it's for life, and you are sexually isolated to just that intimate relationship within marriage. Outside of that, you've got problems, and the society begins to disintegrate.
Okay, now I can see already why JD Unwin isn't quoted much, and probably your analysis isn't either, because you're talking about sexual restraint, and we seem to be living in a culture which is going roaring in the complete opposite direction. So the tipping point is that loosening up, that lack of restraint post and pre-marriage, although in some of the cultures he would have studied, it wouldn't have been called marriage, would it?
No, in fact, that's why he calls it nuptial, prenuptial. And he's very meticulous on defining his terms and trying to define them such that they would apply. You'd find a general term that would apply to all the cultures rather than just ours. Okay,
so we are well past that tipping point. I'm sure Canada is as well. Probably the whole Western culture is. And so actually, just before you tell us the three outcomes, because everyone will be hanging on the edge of their seat. What made you interested in his work? Because I mean, you've got a amazing background yourself. What drew you to JD Unwin?
Well, so Unwin published in 1934, and he actually died young. And he just fell into obscurity, and people basically forgot his work. I don't see much discussion on Unwin for the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s until recently, say the last 10 years. So about 10, 12 years ago, I first heard of Unwin and his work and his study of the 86 civilizations and cultures and how those cultures collapsed once they crossed that, loosened up their sexual restraints. Well, that piqued my interest. I continued to think about that for a few years, but then finally one day I says, I got to get a hold of his book. And of course it's out of print, but fortunately it's available freely And I have links in my article. Okay. You can just download the whole thing there. And so there's been actually, it's not just me that's kind of stumbled on his work. I guess word got around. Yeah. And I'd say for the last 10 years, there's been a lot of interest in his work, except in secular culture. You see, when I tell you what the three predictions are, it will explain to a large extent why secular culture today is not interested in JD Unwin's work.
That's an understatement. Okay, well, let's do it. What are the three consequences of embracing unbridled sexuality?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it doesn't even have to be unbridled sexuality. It's just like prenuptial sexual relations. Yeah. But okay, so there were three things that Unwin observed occurred within these cultures. Number one, the culture, there was, at its peak, the best you could attain, where highest flourishing occurred was where you had prenuptial chastity and what he called strict monogamy. One man, one woman married for life, or in whatever they called it in the culture, that ceremony would bring them together. But once that tipping point was crossed, the first thing, there were three things. One of them was a decline or a breakdown in strict monogamy, such that, and it declined into more like serial relationships, people living together until the relationship no longer worked and they moved in with someone else. And that has happened very clearly in our civilization. I was just looking this morning at some research done by the Pew Foundation. And I compared the marriage amongst the millennials now compared to the silent generation, the boomer generation, and Gen X. Now, the silent generation, which would be my parents, I'm in the boomers. For the silent generation, it was 65% were married between the ages of 18 to 32, 65%. 2/3 were already married at that point. And if they weren't married, they would be single. Now, some would marry later than that because there were a lot of people who married, say, in their 40s. But that has radically changed. It dropped with the boomer generation. It was 48%. Then it was down to Gen X to 36%. And with the millennials, the majority are not getting married. About 3/4, 75% do not get married. Only about 1/4 of the millennials now get married. So what we're seeing is the fulfillment of one of the three predictions.
Well, let me just give you the Kiwi context for, the New Zealand audience watching, but for overseas as well. We just published our marriage rates and it's dropped to just 7.7 couples per 1,000, down from 45.5 back in 1971. I'll put the graph up for people to see the downward slide, but it's about 1/6 of what the marriage rate was in 1971, and people are marrying later. So our fertility rate is going through the floor as well. It should be around 2.2. It's 1.65 or something. So it's very low. And also, just before we do this, the second one, there was a study out of the UK by the Marriage Foundation that found that the de facto, if they're married, they're 3 times more likely to stay together than unmarried parents. They looked at parents of kids who were 13 to 15, and 86% of parents were still together if they were married, if they had children 13 to 15 years old. So there's that sticking glue of marriage, isn't there, over other arrangements?
There is. Okay. We had similars. These are getting old, these stats now here in Canada, but Stats Canada found that 50% of marriages broke up, but you got to be careful there. And that's all marriages. If it was the first marriage, you had a much higher success rate. And if both spouses were married while their parents were still together, it was over 90% success rate. They were married for life. However, for common law relationship living together, 70% broke up within 5 years. And that does not count how many broke up in the first year, because that generally wasn't counted as a common law relationship. So the sticking rate, as you put it, was much higher, radically higher with a marriage than it was for the just living together in common law relationships.
Okay, so that was number one, marriage, one man, one woman for life. What's number two?
Number two is actually a decline in the belief of God, in God. Now, not all cultures believed in, say, the Judeo-Christian God. But in every culture, the more they flourished, the more they had this concept of a god or some gods that were actually in control of nature and the universe, and they kind of had a jurisdiction over humanity. That would be in general. And of course, for the Jews, for the Muslims, for the Christians, there was this monotheistic notion, as well as some other world religions as well, or lesser known religions. But what happened once that threshold was crossed is you began to see a decline in belief in God. And I should stick something in here. It's important to realize, and Unwin emphasizes this, that it took 3 generations for the collapse to occur, but the first generation, you don't see a lot of change, because the first generation after the tipping point still is running on the momentum of the previous generation, who are still alive and well and influencing society. Yeah. So the tipping point sort of kicks the props out from under the culture, but its momentum keeps it going for the first generation. But it's the second generation you really begin to see things decline. And once again, I live in Canada, and we've had a remarkable decline in belief in God, and even an intentional, willful expelling of anything to do with God out of our governments, our school systems, the media. Basically, God has been we not only see a lowering or decline in belief in God, but we also see an intentional
rejection
effort to just try and delete God from our Western culture.
Don't Skype, because I think New Zealand's, either you're following New Zealand or we're following you down the same trail. So sadly, in Australia and the UK and the US is starting that process. So certainly in the Western cultures, they're doing that.
Yeah. And it's especially, just looking at some more information this morning from the Pew Research Center, it's especially prevalent amongst the millennials, which is exactly what you would predict, because the millennials are basically born well into the first generation after the tipping point, which I would say in Canada probably occurred sometime in the 1980s. Right. So we are past that first generation. We're now going into a steeper decline. Yeah. And the third point,
just to revise, so the first was marriage for one man, one woman for life. Second was rejection of God, secularism. Third one?
And I should say what replaces belief in God, and it's actually the superstition and animistic beliefs. And surprisingly, there's been some studies recently that say with the decline of theism in at least Western culture, at least here in North America, there's been a rise in just superstition amongst the non-theists. The third one is a rational thinking went out the window. And that is painfly obvious.
You mean we think we can be the opposite sex? Are you talking that type of irrational thinking?
Oh, well, you see, that is actually a symptom of what replaces rational thinking. And what replaced rational thinking after the tipping point is you believe what you want to believe. Yeah. Believing what you want to believe is now more important than rational thinking. And in fact, I've seen some articles where people are arguing, say more woke articles, rational thinking is racist and colonialist. We need to get rid of it. Yeah. Now, I want to point out, though, that they still use rational thinking when they go to cross the street, if they see a transit bus speeding down towards them. So it's kind of a bit of a double standard there. But
it is specifically around the sexuality area, isn't it? That's where a lot of the focus is.
In fact, specifically around sexuality. And it seems that our sexuality is a powerful driving force, or would be if we just let our bodies control ourselves, or we don't, exercise some self-control here. And so when that happens, sexuality and other bodily desires, they begin to control us rather than we, live within the way it was intended to be. So one of the reasons JD Unwin's research is so completely unpopular and is that basically nobody is interested in basically our secular culture is not interested in his research because it doesn't tell them what they want to hear. And Unwin himself pointed this out back in the 1930s. What he observed in these various cultures was many of them believed they would be an exception. They knew about the decline of other cultures, and they knew that somehow is related, like they were on a sexual change, radically loosening of their restraints, but they thought they would be the exception. And he says, this is so predictable. I was surprised because, today you would expect that. Oh, we always think we're going to be the exception, but
we're trying to persuade ourselves, I think, aren't we?
We didn't invent the idea that we're going to be an exception. That actually is part of human nature that's been going on for thousands of years, back to the time of the Babylonians and the Sumerians, the ancient Greeks and the Romans. So basically, our culture today does not want to hear about Unwin's findings. They assume we will be the exception. And even arguing that we won't is almost offensive to our culture, because they strictly want to believe what they want to believe. And it's just a sad statement when rational thinking is abandoned and instead a culture embraces what they want to believe.
Is this just, some people would say this is just slippage, it's gradual in a liberal democracy, or is this, because as marriage rates drop, there's kind of this flow-on effect and, people have become more liberal in their views around sexuality? Or is it a specific agenda or campaign? Is it a big push organized within academia or within political circles?
You could go out a few different ways on that one, but there is certainly, I don't know what's going on in New Zealand, but in our public school system here in Canada, there is a very deliberate and a very intentional program to socially engineer the children, to the point now that here in Canada, I to be honest, I could not in good conscience send my children into the public school system anymore, because the indoctrination is relentless. And it starts at junior kindergarten, which would be about age 4.
Yeah, look,
and I've seen
exactly the same in New Zealand. And in fact, Unwin has just described what is happening in our education system. We don't talk about marriage. We've pushed out Bible in schools and mention of God. And of course, we've introduced radical sexuality and gender ideology, as you say, being pushed at children as young as 4 and 5. So what's happening in Canada is happening in New Zealand. So we will see the same consequences. One of the questions I have is that political leadership, there's a lot of politicians I know in the Canadian Parliament and in the UK Parliament, Australia and New Zealand, they don't seem to be standing up against this agenda. They're voting for changes to birth certificates. They're voting for bans on conversion therapy. They're voting for same-sex marriage. And yet they themselves in their own lives seem to understand the importance of these moral values. So what's going on there? Why aren't they standing up against this agenda?
Well, might be a bit unfair for me to say what I think because I'm not a politician, but I do have friends who are politicians. And the pressure that they experience to, let's say, compromise, to fall into the party line is enormous. So those who don't, and there have been some in the last, say, 5 years, some politicians who refuse to go to vote for certain things or fall into the party line, they were actually relegated to what we call the backbench in our parliament, or they were expelled from the caucus. They were no longer considered to be members of that party, and there's been several like that. So there's that kind of pressure. I think also it's not just the fault of the politicians. It's the fault of the civilization society they live in as well, because they're doing the polls. And they sense that the civilization is heading this way, and if they go that way, they're done. They won't get elected. That being said, I am surprised at how people can be influenced by politicians, and I saw that to an enormous degree in the past 2 years, where you just hear the same things over and over again. The majority, actually, of the population will start believing that. So I think there is room for politicians to just start taking some leadership there, start standing up for what's right. And they might be surprised. They might be surprised at how the population will swerve in behind them if they just, set the example.
Okay, so that's the final question I want to ask you about what can we do. But just before we do that, what does Unwin say is a consequence of this decline in marriage and sexual restraint, the decline in belief in God, and the basically I can do whatever I want, let's redefine gender and sexuality and everything, my rights? Mm-hmm. What's the consequence?
Well, it's the collapse of that culture. Now, the collapse was discussed by Unwin. It usually can take two major types of collapses. One would be just a complete collapse into anarchy and everybody for himself. It's kind of like one of those post-apocalyptic movies you see where people are scrounging for food and fighting each other for resources. But more often, it was the invasion of that country or that culture by another culture that had higher he called them higher energy. That was his term, higher energy. He actually admitted he didn't know why the collapse occurred, and it was inevitable. It was irreversible. There were no exceptions. And so this is what I'm saying to the culture today, is we are on our way now. So what are we going to do about this? And it's not just a matter of throwing up your hands and saying, well, here we go. No, because there were people, he made it clear that in every culture, they were almost never homogeneous, that there were different levels within the culture. And there were still people, even after the tipping point, that still held to a high standard of sexual morality and marriage and so forth. And those people tended to survive a collapse, and they tended to be the seed or the core that rebuilt that culture, rebuilt the civilization. So the first thing when I think to myself, what can we do about it? I forgot to mention, I've been married it'll be 42 years in July. We have 6 children. They're all married. I am still active in trying to mentor in a good way, in a very, appropriate way, still mentoring my adult children in various ways. First of all, they see our marriage. They see that we wouldn't trade it for the world, and they've all got good marriages as a result. It's amazing. So basically, what can we do about it? I can't necessarily make the culture change, but what I can do is, first of all, I can look at myself and saying, okay, what am I going to do about this? Am I going to maintain that high standard? And am I going to encourage others? And in fact, that starts. I do a lot of speaking to young people, to teens. And I see as part of our role here is to encourage teenagers to just rethink the cultural programming they're being subjected to and start contemplating the possibility that their notion of, say, love that's being promoted in society is actually just a cheap counterfeit, actually, of the real thing. And the real thing they can have if they want to be committed to that. I should also mention,
that's a real challenge for our young people, because they're living in a culture that is saturated by this free sexuality. It's saturated by hardcore pornography that we never had to face when we were growing up, not to that extent. So they are just completely immersed in this sexual culture. And I think everybody is thinking, wow, things are speeding up. It's getting really radical really fast. You can almost see, the mass building, can't you?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I know. I grieve. I grieve for not so much my children, because they came through at the very beginning of this, of the millennials. None of them, well, I guess I do have 2 that will be classified as millennials, or 1 actually. But what I grieve for is my grandchildren. I've got 10 now and more on the way. Like you say, it's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose, but the fire hose is spewing sewage. And so what do you do? Now, I think one of the things that results of this, Unwin didn't know why the culture collapsed. He just made these observations. But I wrote in my article, The Findings of Mary Eberstadt, about how the sexual revolution has robbed people of their identity, especially the millennials, of their identity that they would have had they grown up in a lifelong marriage with lots of siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles. And that actually provides a very secure environment for very good mental health. we've seen an explosion in mental health challenges now, which is part of, I think, a major reason why that collapse occurs. Yeah. There was just a heading in our news the 2 weeks ago. The heading was this: the millennials don't want to work. So how are we going to survive? That was basically it. Now that's generalized, of course, because we taught our kids the work ethic. I even wrote an article on the work ethic and how to do well in your career and your job. But
it's interesting you talk about the mental stress, because we have a major problem with mental health issues with our young people, and it's exploded, and not just over. You can't just blame lockdowns and COVID. It's over the last 10 years, there's been a massive explosion. So, we can almost see this outworking. So you're saying, in terms of what can we do, we need to model good marriages. We need to mentor as much as we can. Yes. Anything else?
Well, I have opportunities to speak in different places to youth, especially, and to parents, and but that's more like the mentoring aspect of things. Yeah. And but I think number one is, how am I doing, and in my relationship, and what kind of a marriage am I modeling, and that gets around in the neighborhood. Yeah. And people will ask me. So they see you. They see your marriages. They see whatever area you're gifted in, might be writing, making YouTube videos, even TikTok videos. Yeah. Different people have different venues, different arenas that they can promote a healthy marriage and high sexual morality standards. I would have to say that, some people get the impression that, Unwin's against sex, or not at all. Sex has its proper place within marriage, but it's so much. It's orders of magnitude better because it occurs within the context of a lifelong commitment and the trust that comes with that. And there again, people somehow pick this up, even if you're not talking about it.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to understand that the culture is increasingly turning up the heat on biblical sexual morality. That kind of morality is now unacceptable. It's public enemy number one for those who want to go down, this sexual revolution path. And so there's going to be a lot of conflict there, and we need to get ready for that, don't we? So we need to keep speaking the truth and be brave.
Yeah, and when you mentioned the religious aspect of things, my number one recommendation for, I don't know what your audience is and how many are, Christian or not.
Bit of everything. Family. Yeah.
So, just take this, each person can take this for what they think it's worth. Mm-hmm. But for me, and what I say to young people, the first step is the greatest command that was ever given is just to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And I just ask God, help me do that. And I find as we focus on the one who is the origin of every good thing and every beauty and music and everything else, God is the origin of every good thing, then I begin to see a different kind of beauty that's available to us. And the relationships flourish so much better. Yeah. And it has changed my life. It's just, and I think it has been fundamental in my relationship with my wife too, and my relationship with other people. So if I am doing well spiritually, I am doing well with my relationships with other people, my wife, my family, my grandchildren, my neighbors, and so forth.
It's good for all of us to know that there's someone who can plan our lives better than we can, and who has more wisdom. We need that, especially in the culture that we're living in. Kirk,
especially now.
Yeah, especially now. Kirk, we're out of time, but I will include in the in this broadcast just a link through to your blog spot so people can check you out, and also check out your articles on JD Unwin and get a bit more information. Because I think, when we get our head around this, it's almost like JD Unwin was a bit of a prophet for the 21st century.
It was,
and we can already see some evidence of that. So Kirk, bless you in your ministry as you go around Canada and to universities, crucial areas, and really appreciate your time from Canada today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.